Hi, it's John Hall, and I'm taking advantage of the September heat wave happening now across New Jersey, which means Oktoberfest beers and the backyard inflatable pool. So I'm glad to bring you this special episode of the All About Beer podcast with Don Tess and M. Souter as they speak with Ron Pattinson and Mike Karnowski about IPAs through time. Their show can use your support. Please consider becoming a sponsor of All About Beer through our Patreon link. That's patreon.com/allaboutbeer. Or if your company is interested in advertising and keeping their show moving along, please email info@allaboutbeer.com and we'll get you everything you need to know. Don't forget, you can follow All About Beer on social media and visit allaboutbeer.com every day for new content. And now, please enjoy this episode of the All About Beer podcast with M. Souter and Don Tess.
I'm Don Tess, better known as the Don of Beer.
And I'm M. Sauter, better known as Pints and Panels.
Welcome to the 27th episode of the All About Beer podcast. Every 2 weeks, we talk with leading experts and take a deep dive into one topic in beer. This week on the show, we're going to talk about IPAs through time. Visit allaboutbeer.com and follow us on social media @allaboutbeer. Or throw us a few bucks through Patreon. Go to patreon.com/allaboutbeer to support this show and others. So, you know how when you recommend a great movie or a great book to a friend, and after they watch the movie or read the book, and they tell you how much they loved it, you feel happy for having shared that knowledge with them?
Yeah, of course. It feels great to share good things and things I love with people that I care about.
Yeah. So that's the feeling people will get when they let their friends know about the All About Beer podcast. The listenership of this show is really skyrocketed the last 2 months. And so I want to thank everybody who has shared it, but also want to ask everybody to continue sharing it.
Yes, thank you so much. But let's keep it going. If there's someone you know who think would enjoy this show, please, please, please share it with them.
And go ahead and tag us on social media when you do share it. Then we can thank you and welcome the new listener. So, Em, I have an esoteric question for you.
All right, bring it on.
Have you ever had an IPA? I
Never,
think it's
never heard of it.
Yeah, it's a pretty obscure style, I think. I've had like dozens of different beers and I've never heard of IPA.
Well, I love visual beer education. So I can tell you, Don, that the IPA is one of the most popular beer styles in craft beer, and there are dozens of variations. But it started hundreds of years ago, rather, and it's changed through time. And so now there was one single IPA, and now there's more than 25. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I really look forward to our two guests telling us all about it. But first, here's a word from our sponsor. And if you'd like to help support the All About Beer podcast, please reach out to podcast@allaboutbeer.com.
Estrella Galicia is an independent family-owned brewery in northwest Spain, founded in 1906. Estrella Galicia Cerveza Especial is a world-class lager brewed using the finest Spanish malts, locally cultivated Galician hops, and the best brewing practices made out of the state-of-the-art facility in A Coruna. Recognized around the world for quality and exceptional character, Estrella Galicia is a beer like no other. To learn more about Estrella Galicia, follow them at Estrella Galicia USA on Instagram.
Looking for an easy hop sourcing experience? Yakima Valley Hops offers the finest quality hops from right here in our valley and premium growing regions around the world. Get the hops you need when you need them with ultra-fast shipping and awesome customer service. With a full line of liquid hop products and all your favorite varieties, no contracts are needed to brew with the best. Shop now at yakimavalleyhops.com. That's YAKIMA valleyhops.com.
Ron Pattinson is a British beer writer and historian who lives in Amsterdam. He has wasted the last 2 decades of his twilight years researching and obsessing over many beer-related topics. On his Shut Up About Barclay Perkins blog, he writes an excruciating detail about beer history, mostly of British beer styles, with excursions across the channel into German, Austrian, Dutch, and Scandinavian beer history. The books he has authored on beer history are almost innumerable. They're mostly significant for their single-word titles such as porter, mild, and bitter, and their enormous page count. His published works include a book on brewing historic beers called The Homebrewer's Guide to Vintage Beer, and the definitive work on Scottish beer and brewing, the snappily titled Scotland, Volume 2. The few copies of his books to be sold mostly reside in brewers' offices. He is married and the father of 2 sons in their 20s, neither of whom have yet bothered to move out, despite numerous hints. Welcome to the show, Ron.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you. So this episode is mostly about IPAs through time, but I know you're passionate about generally dispelling myths about IPA. So why don't we start by you telling us a couple of the most shocking myths about IPA that you've found are false?
Oh, well, the most shocking one was it was made especially strong, so it survived the journey
And
So-
that is false.
to India, which is just not true.
What was the
Um,
what was the ABV then?
Wow, I got this. I knew this was going to come up, so I've got this. I've got this ready, and I've got some stuff about early IPAs. Okay, so the first IPA I've got an actual brewing record for is from 1839, and it has an original gravity of 1057.
Oh, so it's only like 5.5% or so ABV.
Yeah, and I've got details of a whole load of IPAs that were exported to India in the 1840s, and lots of them are under 1050.
Oh, even
So
lower.
they're like session IPAs.
Yeah, sorry, not under 1050, under 1060. So you've got
Oh,
lots of
1060. Okay.
so you've got some that are as low as 1053, and these are beers which were genuinely exported to India as well.
Were they
do.
were they called IPAs at that stuff? I thought the IPA moniker shows up in what, 1829?
Yeah, these are from 1844.
Okay. Okay.
So these are IPAs, and this comes from the Scottish Ale Brewer, and
Oh.
it specifically says which ones were for export, and so it says some of them you can see the domestic ones, and some of them it says export India. So they're ones that genuinely went to India. Yeah, people get the wrong idea, but people are obsessed with it being high, particularly strong. You look at Bass's beers from the 1860s, their IPA has the second lowest OG. No, it has equal lowest OG of all the beers they brewed. And the beer that it's equal to is their weakest mild. Every other single beer they brewed had a higher OG than their IPA.
So it's not that they didn't make higher alcohol beer. They deliberately
No,
were
they didn't want
shipping
it
the
that
lowest.
strong. People didn't want a big heavy beer in India. That was the point. They might have brewed them even lower, but for the fact of the way the tax system worked, which basically meant that you couldn't really export. You would be losing money if you exported something that was lower than about 1050. So they might well have actually exported weaker beer to India if they could have.
Any evidence that they sent a beer that was 1050 or maybe slightly more than 1050 because of the tax law? Any evidence that they might have diluted it when it got to India?
No, there's no evidence of that.
No. Okay.
So I mean, if you look at the gravities, I mean, I'm looking at this table of ones from the 1840s, and I think the lowest gravity is 1052, and the highest one is 1070. But you have to realize that that's not strong for the first half of the 19th century. You're looking at the base level mild ales with 6.5% alcohol at the time. So a beer that's 6.5-7% alcohol is not strong. It's like a middle of the road beer for the 19th century. The strong beers, they're over 1100.
Right.
So they're not sending those aren't going to India. So everyone who says like, oh, because I literally just wrote an article about this and I talk about sending stock ales.
You're gonna have to retract it.
I know, and I 100% will, because when Ron says something, he's right, and he always brings receipts, and that's why I respect him.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
when you say it's a stock ale,
Mhm.
that's still true.
Okay.
They were stock ales.
Okay.
I mean, the story I will always tell people is about Bass IPA, which is completely insane the way that they brewed it. That they brew the beer, they stick it into the hogsheads, and then they just dump it in the brewery yard and leave it there for a year, just out in the open. And then after a year, then they put it on the ship to India.
Why?
Why? Well, because it's because of one of the main protections that IPA had on its journey to India was the fact that there was nothing fermentable left in it. So that year it had in the casks in the brewery yard, Britannomyces stripped out every last bit of fermentable material so that when they stuck it on the ships, there was nothing for anything nasty to ferment anymore. And this is one of the big things about IPA in the 19th century is the incredible rate of attenuation. And I've got analyses of Bass from the late 19th century, bottles of Bass, and the original gravity is 1065 and the finishing gravity is 1001. So it's almost 100% attenuated.
Oof.
I bet that was delicious.
And also these people making Brett IPAs, that's just historic IPA. All IPA would have been Brett IPA.
Yes, because there were stock beers. And this is the thing, that there were stock pale ales. And so up until about the 1840s, all pale ales in England were brewed as stock pale ales, which meant that they were quite often brewed in October and they're not actually drunk until the next summer. And you see these old adverts from British breweries where they're saying, right, this is our stock pale ale. It's guaranteed to last for a year if you don't open the cask. So it was good for a year, they said, and it was, and that would have been aged for probably at least a year before they even sent it out.
It's really fun that the original IPA is an aged beer when now people are so
if it's more than a
obsessed.
week old.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
That's
This is one of the things that I find really amusing.
I'm sure you do.
It's a complete reversal of the way it used to be.
Yeah.
And you see that running pale ales, they don't really appear until like the 1850s, and then you get the new style of pale ale gradually takes over as the 19th century goes along, and the stock pale ales fall out of favour until eventually all you've got after World War I, the only people brewing stock pale ales anymore were really brewers in Burton, where you'd still got some proper Burton IPAs being brewed. But apart from that, the stock pale ales had basically disappeared, and you'd got the running beers, which are basically what modern bitter is.
I see.
Yeah, so running beer, that's not is that a party guile thing where they're using second? It's just this. It's just a lower alcohol version.
No. It doesn't even necessarily mean lower alcohol. It just means a beer that hasn't been aged.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
So you get this thing where originally they're all aged, the pale ales now, and also the differentiation between IPA and pale ale is pretty much impossible to make in British beer. The terms were used randomly, and so you find that the classic English IPA from Bass was never called IPA by the brewery. They only ever called it pale ale.
So and then you've got Green King now makes an IPA that's 3%, where my BJCP home brewer judger brain is no, IPAs are 5.5 and more. So
okay, right. You've got different types of IPA.
Yeah, of course.
And what you find in London is that when the brewers started, like say Whitbread, it's one of the big London breweries, when they started brewing pale ale, first one they brewed in the 1860s, they called pale ale. And that was sort of like a classic Burton pale ale in lots of ways. It was about 1065, so 6.5% ABV, something like that. And then towards the end of the 19th century, I think in 1899, they introduced a new beer called IPA, which only had a gravity of 1050, which for pre-World War I is not very strong. And that beer then carried on into the interwar years and became what I would call a London style of IPA, which you had there, which was a relatively low gravity bottled beer that was actually quite hoppy. The Whitbread version was quite heavily hopped, but most of the time wasn't above 4% ABV in the interwar period. So quite a weak beer. And you have this type of bottled beer of low gravity IPA still exists. So Harvey's, one of the classic London ale breweries, British ale breweries, they brew a beer called IPA nowadays, a bottled beer that's about 3% ABV. And there's a tradition of these beers, and Green King IPA fits in with that.
Okay.
And it's a huge problem when you're looking at British beers to pick apart IPA and pale ale. And the only way I can do it is I go by what the brewer says. And the only exception I make to that is Bass, because I know that was an IPA. But other than that, I can only ever go by what the brewer calls it, because there's no consistency. One brewery might have the IPA as the stronger beer. That's normally the case in Burton. When you go to London, pale ale's the stronger beer and IPA is the weaker one. So the way, you know, people in the States think now in the hierarchy of ales is that IPA is stronger than pale ale. That's not always been the case. And it's an absolute nightmare, honestly, in Britain. I've just been writing some stuff about the 1970s. And there are these beers, and these analyses I've got of British beers from the early 1970s. And I can see some of them, I know these things are actually IPAs or were originally IPAs, but they're not being called that. They're mostly just being called bitter. And I can sort of pull out some of them because I know, well, the Truman's, Ben Truman, that's their P1B from the 19th century. That's their equivalent of Bass Pale Ale. So that's like a classic Burton IPA, but they weren't calling it that. And virtually none of the beers that I picked out to be IPAs in the bottled collection of beers were actually marketed as IPAs. I think there's only one of the bunch that actually said IPA in the name, but I knew that the rest of them were. And it's just a nightmare. And yeah, I recently wrote something about the BJCP definition of English IPA, which was mostly just like an American's idea of what English IPA should be, rather than based on beers that have actually ever been brewed in the UK.
It feels to me like when I see the BJCP version of English IPA, it's what American brewers brew that style to.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is just an American IPA with a little more crystal and malt, and then
And Goldings
English
and Fuggles.
Yeah, and Fuggles and some Maris Otter.
But crystal malt. God, no, you know, crystal malt in pale ales.
I love your reaction.
I'm telling you what
It's
no, okay.
It's an
Go ahead,
incredibly recent thing. I've not found a single IPA or pale ale before World War I that had crystal malt in it.
When does crystal malt show up in malt technology? Actually, do you know the answer to that?
Late 19th century.
Okay. Oh, okay. So it's
it was specifically developed for mild.
I will hold on a second. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I will retract my crystal malt statement, because I'm reading the BJCP 2021 English IPA. It says pale ale malt, English hops, attenuative British ale yeast, refined sugar may be used, optional sulfate character. So there is no mention of crystal malt. So Gordon Strong, if you're listening, I'm sorry. So
yeah, so crystal malt only really turns up after World War II in pale ales. You get it a bit between the wars, but not much. You know, it's a fairly recent thing. And I think it's people trying to compensate for the fall in gravity is why they started putting it into pale ale recipes.
Oh, I see. Okay, there's a lot to digest there.
I know. I love it. Talking to Ron is like talking to a dictionary that like talks back to you, or an encyclopedia, and it makes me very pleased.
Blew my mind with the very first thing you said. Okay, so the typical craft beer drinker today thinks of IPA as high alcohol, highly hopped. So you've blown the high alcohol thing out of the water. Highly hopped, yes?
Yes, because they were stock ales and they were meant for export. So the longer a beer was meant to be kept before it was sold, the more hops they threw in it.
Were things like concepts like dry hopping a thing, or would it just be very bitter? Okay, so they would have been dry hopped.
Yeah. But most British beers were dry hopped. I mean, it's difficult in the brewing records because they often don't mention the dry hops, which is irritating. But in the ones where they do, I've seen breweries that were dry hopping everything. Well, I mean, Tetley's, which is one of my favorite beers when I was younger, which is was a big industrial brewery, they were dry hopping their mild in the 1980s.
Wow. When does dry hopping show up in your brewing records? Like when do I mean, if people are always doing it, but when does it start?
It's early 20th century, I think, the first time that I've seen it actually mentioned. Maybe late 19th.
Okay.
I think the William Youngers ones, they give the dry hops. And again, this is something else. So this is Youngers, which is a Scottish brewery, and they were dry hopping Scotch ales.
Ooh, I want one of those.
Well, they also use SARS as well.
Really? Why would they use Saaz?
Because it's a good hop.
I mean, besides Saaz being wonderful, it just seems, yeah.
You just have to remember that in the late 19th century, British brewing was brewing a lot of beer, and they were using an incredible amount of hops, and they couldn't grow enough hops in the UK. So some years I've worked out that the UK brewing industry was using half of the hops that had been grown in the whole world.
What?
Yeah.
Wow.
It's awesome.
It was that high a percentage. Britain was one of the largest hop producers. I mean, late 19th century, it's about even between the UK, the USA, and Germany. And even though it was a massive hop producer, it could not produce enough hops for its beer. So, which is why you find that loads and loads of American hops come in after the 1850s. So, in late 19th century, you're looking at, so between, say, 1870 and World War One, most years between 25 and 50% of the hops used in UK brewing were American. A huge percentage of the American hop production was exported to the UK. Well, of course, they hated the hops.
They're like New York State cluster hops, right? So they're
to start with, and then later on West Coast hops.
Okay, yeah.
So you see, they make there's a differentiation they make in the brewing records. They'll say American hops generally meant New York State, and then when the hop industry moved west, then you see they'll say things like Pacific, Californian, Oregon, Washington, British Columbian, stuff like that. So you can see that they're differentiating between the two areas in the US by what they call them.
That makes
But I mean, generally they wouldn't have put them. Well, they might have put them in an IPA, but they'd have put them in as the early kettle hops, which is the way American hops were normally used.
Right.
Yeah, because they didn't want the flavor, right? Of the American
they didn't like
hops.
the flavor.
They didn't like, which is fun because now everyone likes, they're looking for the flavor. And back then they were just looking for the bitterness. How the tables have turned.
Yeah, well, I mean, the whole thing about hopping in British brewing is, certainly in the 19th century, a lot of the hopping is nothing to do with the flavor of the beer. They're using the hops as a preservative. Right. And so sometimes, some of the hops, they're not interested in the flavor from them. They just want the preservative qualities of those hops. And because they're using masses of them. I mean, I've seen brews from London breweries where they're putting in literally 1 ton of leaf hops into a single brew.
1 ton?
Yeah, won't have been in a single mash tun. It would have been over, or a single copper, it would have been over several, but a single brew, over 2,000 pounds of hops.
Jesus.
I find it also interesting because you mentioned Saaz, that how everything new was once, it's already been done. Like people are using Saaz hops in IPAs now because apparently it's got, the thiols and whatever that are biotransformative. But the Brits already did it, so I think that's
well, every time people think they've come up with something new, I can normally go back and find an example of it being done in the past.
Right.
There's a lot of beer history, and people have tried a lot of things.
And brut IPA. Well, you were saying that the original IPAs were bone dry. So
I mean, it's amazing. You look at the final gravities of them; it's like barely over 1,000. And so for the gravity, they are actually quite strong beers. So you've got Bass. I think some of them. I think it's like 1065, but it's coming out to 7.5% ABV. because it's so highly attenuated. But I mean, another thing I wanted to mention this was when you're on about beer going to India, of course, most of the beer going into India wasn't IPA.
What was it?
Well, most of it was porter.
Yeah.
Porter. Was that I mean, porter is, the macro beer of its day, so it makes sense that it would, but would it get the same kind of heavily hopped Brett carrot? So it would be this kind of dry, funky porter that's showing up?
Yeah, it's exactly the same thing. So just the way that IPA was a pale ale, just hopped more heavily and really heavily attenuated, you see the same thing with the porters. So I mean, the way I know how much more porter went than IPA is because I've seen the advertisements that the East India Company put in newspapers asking for tenders to supply beer. And usually the quantity of porter they're asking for is 2 to 3 times as much as the quantity of pale ale.
Pale ale. Huh. I
And,
wonder. Yeah.
Well, there's a really simple reason for this: class. So the pale ale, that was for the officers and for the officials of the East India Company. The porter, that was for the ordinary soldiers. So they got porter in their canteens, and the reason they had porter is that they noticed that they didn't die as quickly if they had porter rather than drinking spirits.
Jeez.
And I've actually seen a report from a medical officer in India explaining, saying, oh, these different regions of India, and in this one they have beer, in this one they have spirits, and the death rate's 4 times as high in the one where they have spirits.
Thanks.
And that class issue might be why we hold IPA and pale ale in higher regard in present day versus the darker beers. Is that even mild? Is that fair? Or
yeah, well, I mean, the whole thing is you look at IPA and pale ale in Britain, especially in the earlier part of the 19th century, it's an expensive beer. It's not coal miners who are drinking this stuff. It's the middle classes who are drinking pale ale because it's expensive. So, I mean, I was saying about Bass how the IPA had the joint lowest gravity of any of their beers. It also had one of the highest prices of any of their beers. So it was costing more than beers that were a lot stronger because it sold as a premium IPA. And you see this all the way through the 19th century, that it's IPA, beers called IPA like Bass, they're probably 20-25% more expensive than most of the beers of the same strength.
Why would they be more expensive? Is it just a marketing tactic?
Well, yes, because it was this fancy new beer. And it's like everything when it comes in. Pilsner was a fancy, expensive beer when it was first introduced. This is often the route that beers take, that they start off as something exclusive and special, and it's an aspirational thing, and people want to drink it. And then brewers gradually corrupt it as time goes on so they can make it cheaper.
Hefeweizen is the same way.
Because
Because the wheat beers are brewed by royalty, and that's what all the like higher classes drink, and then gradually it goes through the classes, and then wheat beer proliferates, and then dark beers show up. So yeah, I guess it's very interesting how marketing through time and class through time is it's age old.
it's ageless.
It's ageless. So
Yeah, and I mean, I love looking at the way fashions in beer go over time. And someone was saying something really interesting to me the other day about lager, that it seems to be getting the thing that's a death knell for any beer style, which seems to be getting to be associated with old men, which is normally when a beer style is just about to die.
kind of like how mild
Like
in
mild,
the 50s.
Yeah, or milk stout. Well, milk stout was even worse. That was the stuff that grannies drank.
Oh.
I'm amazed that milk stouts managed to make a comeback.
Yeah, everything that's old is new. Like the dark mild trend in America right now is quite not, I wouldn't say strong, but there's a fair amount of breweries brewing dark milds, and I'm very happy with it as a dark beer lover, and beer geek. But yeah, it'll be interesting. What do you think the future of like hazy, and what the future of just IPA in general? Where do you see
Where's
that?
it going?
Where's it going? I'm sure you get asked that question constantly.
I think they've almost flogged it to death, to be honest. It's like just calling everything some type of IPA. And just what I was saying about milk stout and mild, IPA is going to end up like that as well. And when beers go out of fashion, when they have the wrong association, it's remarkable how quickly the sales can fall off.
Absolutely.
I mean, mild went from 50% of UK beer production in 1960 to 17% in 1970.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
10 years.
Yeah. And then put another 10 years on that, and it's down to 8%.
Oh, wow.
So if you were drinking a dark mild in like 1981, let's say,
Yeah.
you were in the very, very, very small minority.
Well, you were probably in the West Midlands.
Or it was regional. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So there'd be places where, I mean, some bits of the north as well, but very patchy. I mean, even when I started drinking in the mid-70s, there were parts of the country where there was virtually no mild. So London, it was pretty much dead by then, northeast of England as well.
I'm going to stock up on hazy IPAs because I might not be able to get them.
No, yeah, I think we're okay for
hazy IPAs.
a while.
I got a 10-year supply.
One thing I'll throw in about this, about hazy IPAs, right? Every time I'm in the US, I ask every single brewer I meet, professional brewer, what they think of a hazy IPAs, right? And do you know how many I've got to say like them?
Probably not a lot.
Not one.
What?
I like
gotta be
them,
one.
but I'm not
I
a
like them.
brewer.
But
I like
professional
them.
brewers, honestly, every single one I've asked, none of them like them. They all think they're crap, and they only brew them because they have to.
They sell. I've noticed anytime I do IPA content on social media, I get so much more like a conversation, engagement. Thank you, Don. Then let's say like me talking about, sadly, like Schwartz beer. But I mean, I also love all beer. I can't help myself. But yeah, no, I mean, it's brewers. When you go to a brewery and you're visiting brewers want lagers now. But what does that mean? There's so much. If I was a brewer, I want someone to bring me a Burton ale. Does anyone brew a Burton ale? Like a classic one?
Yeah, Young's Winter Warmer.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Which was called Burton up until the mid-1970s, I think.
Okay.
They just renamed it. That's basically the Burton ale they've been brewing.
Where is Young's being brewed? Because didn't they sell the brewery?
Yeah, they sold the brewery, and then it was being at Wells and Young, I think.
Oh,
I don't know if
okay.
it's still being brewed there, because that changed ownership. It's confusing. I mean, the other thing is that there's been someone brewing on the site in Wandsworth the whole time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because they got the claim to be the oldest continuous brewing site in the UK.
Right.
And so someone didn't want them to lose that, so they've been brewing there all the time, just like, I don't know, 20 gallons at a time.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Hey, you gotta keep it up,
I'd like to get your thoughts on how we kind of touched upon hazy IPA, and you also touched upon how there's just slap IPA on any beer, add some extra hops, and people seem to want to buy it. How has modern craft beer, particularly in America, influenced traditional British IPA, and particularly cask ale, which is, I think, something special and unique to Britain?
Well, I think the American influence you've seen in British cask beer is people using American hops or modern American hops in things like bitters, which can work really well. And yeah, you've got the two schools basically. So you've got people who are just trying to brew beers that are exactly like the ones brewed in the US.
Yeah.
And then older brewers who are perhaps maybe trying to use American hops in more traditional types of British beer. So yeah, I mean, personally, I prefer the second approach, and it's sometimes a bit depressing when everyone in the whole world's trying to brew the same beers as in the US, and it's a bit strange.
Right.
Yeah, I was in Vietnam. I was in Vietnam a few months ago, and there, yeah, there's loads of American style beers.
Yeah.
I've had hazy IPAs from Russia. I had a cold IPA in South Africa. 2 cold IPAs from 2 separate breweries. So yeah, it's pretty interesting how the globalization of the beer scene.
Well, I mean, what I've noticed is that things move incredibly quickly now.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas if you went back 20 years, it might take a couple of years from some trend for the States to get anywhere else. I mean, now you see it just whips around the world really quickly.
Right. So hazy IPA on cask?
Yeah, I guess you could do that.
Glitter IPA on cask?
You could do that. I mean, you could do that. It's just, yeah. What about, go ahead, Ron.
What I'm looking forward to is a nice Dunklers on cask in a couple of weeks.
Oh.
Where are you going to get that?
Yeah, where can I find this?
Where I'm going to get that is in my brother's house.
All right, guess it's make it yourself.
It's a beer brewed by because one of my school friends has a brewery. So
nice.
When I go over to Brittany, normally gives us a cask of beer to have in my brother's house. So and we can get through a firkin easily enough in a weekend.
And Ron, you're okay with these kind of, like, I obviously you love the history of beer, and then you're gonna do this. You're gonna drink this weird. I'm gonna call it weird, cask conditioned Dunkless, and you're cool with that. Like you.
Yeah, well, I like Dunkless and I like cask conditioned beer.
Okay.
So.
Let the man drink what he wants.
Yeah, no, I just find that
drink what you want.
I think a lot of people think of historians as being anti-modernization or anti-experimentation.
No. Well,
that's not the case at all.
The thing for me is that I find it interesting how beer is developing and how beer styles are developing. So it doesn't. Yeah, I expect it to be change. That's just the way it works, and you know, and the more I've studied history, and the further you go back, the more you see how everything's cyclical. So beer styles come and they go. You know, style turns up, becomes incredibly popular, and then slowly fades away, and it keeps happening over history. So I mean, it's interesting to see the new beers coming up. I mean, I would say what interests me most at the moment is what's going to replace pale lager as the world's most popular style.
You think that's going to happen?
Well, it's happened every time in the past, so I don't see why Pilsner should be any exception.
Yeah.
Glitter mild is going to do it.
Glitter
that would be weird.
Heineken glitter mild.
Yes. 0-0. Heineken glitter
I was
mild.
going to
0-0.
actually the only thing I could see is at the proliferation of, I just butchered that word, of non-alcoholic beers. How there's so many, the pale lager NA beers are really popular. Which I mean, you know, and then how does that change over time? And
well, that's come. Right.
Yeah.
This has happened since I've been drinking, I think 3 or 4 times.
Oh, okay. So this is
and there's this thing for non-alcoholic beer, and it comes and it goes.
Okay.
Interesting.
I would say at the moment it looks like it's found a niche, but how big it's ever going to get, I don't know.
Okay.
There's probably more scope for just lower alcohol beers, I would have said.
Yeah, which mostly British. I mean, I think maybe that's why the breweries in America are gravitating. That's why I'm seeing more dark miles. It's really great to see a 3.8% beer on a tap board at a brewery in America, because there are a lot of breweries where you go and you're like, cool, everything's above 7. Like,
Yeah.
I have to operate a car.
Yeah, that amazes me sometimes. I mean, couple of times I've been in the States, I haven't been impressed with the range of beers in most beer bars. It's been, what's that I said? I summed this up, it's either IPA, cloudy IPA with shit in it, sour beer,
Double dry hop.
Sour beer,
Yeah.
sour beer with lactose and shit in it, Pilsner.
Hey, at least there's pills. Yeah.
And so there'd be like one lager, and all the rest would just be sour and IPAs.
Rod, just be thankful it wasn't a lactose Pilsner.
That doesn't exist. I've never
Yes,
seen
it
that
does exist.
before.
I've
It
had
does
it.
exist, but I'm
it.
sure, yeah, but I've never. That's yeah. I have a question. What about the new? I know in the UK there's lots of new hops like Jester and Olicana that are brewed to or grown rather to mimic like the fruitiness. How do you think that plays into the future and the past of the IPA?
Well, I guess, but I mean, one of the things I've often said to people is that most of the true innovation that there's been in beer in the last 30 years has come from the hop breeders. And that's where genuinely new flavors have come from. It's from people breeding, different hops with different flavors in them. So, I mean, yeah, a style of beer like IPA, where it's all about hops, I'm sure it's going to be very important, the development of all the new varieties. But I mean, it's not just in the UK. You see in Germany, they've been breeding new varieties as well.
Yeah, that Hallertau Blanc gets me. That's my favorite hop.
Okay,
really?
It's like straight pineapple.
Oh, right.
It's really, really lovely. That's what I get. I get pineapple in it, and it's a lot, especially with IPAs. Like it's beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, what I would imagine is going to happen in future is, as you've seen, that the innovation in hop breeding seems to be spreading over to other places. So you're getting, and obviously because of the way hops are, which is that they're always going to taste different depending on where you grow them, that there's a lot of scope for all the hop regions developing new types of flavors. I mean, maybe trying to go for some of the American style ones with all the fruitiness, but they're always going to have their own twist just because they're grown somewhere different.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that's quite exciting, seeing what's going to happen with hops. But I mean, I would say that, things like Goldings, you use enough Goldings and whole leaf Goldings, and you start getting citrus flavors out of them. It's really odd. I mean, I've had arguments with people about this. Well, people who've never tasted a beer that had a load of them in, but still seem to think they knew what they were talking about, which is, I find quite baffling. But yeah, I did a beer with Pretty Things, which is weirdly a mild, that had loads and loads of whole leaf Goldings, and it was absolutely magical, the effect. And they rebrewed the beer and did it with pellet hops, and it wasn't the same.
That is fascinating. Love that.
So yes, I think Goldings, if they're used in the right way, I think can be pretty magical.
So if we have people visiting the UK, what is one or two beers that you would recommend in terms of understanding preferably historic British IPA? I know that you can't get it per se, but anything that kind of showcases what it might have been like?
I would have said White Shield, but I don't know if I think they might have discontinued that again, because that was
Worthington. Is that Worthington?
Yeah.
Because that has a lineage back to the 19th century.
Yeah.
I mean, that was also the same beer as, for a while, you had Bass Red Triangle and Worthington White Shield that were the same beer. So you could argue that Worthington White Shield is like the successor to Bass Red Triangle. So, yeah, Thornbridge. I mean, I quite like Jaipur, but
yes,
but that's sort of quite a modern style of IPA.
yeah, it is quite delicious though.
It is very good.
Yeah, I do like Jaipur, and it works very nicely on cask. I tell you what else I had. Fresh squeezed IPA I had on cask once.
From Deschutes?
Yeah, it was absolutely amazing. One of the best beers I've ever drunk.
Oh, wow.
Huh.
And people say IPAs don't work on cask. Not sure all that was so good. I think I had 4 pints of it and had to leave before I fell over.
Jaipur on cask I had it in Sheffield at the pub in the train station.
Oh, right. That's really nice, isn't it?
It's a very, yeah. I did a pub tour of Sheffield with Matt Curtis, and he insisted the minute we got to Sheffield that was our first, was a half of Jaipur at the train station, and it was excellent. So it really set the mood for a wonderful day of drinking in Sheffield. So.
Oh, Sheffield's really brilliant for pubs.
That was a wonderful experience. I got to go back to.
Did you go to St. Mars of the Desert?
Oh yeah, the new pretty. I call it new pretty things because in my head, yeah, and they had they gave me a bunch of cans, and they had their barley wine, and I got to share it with a bunch of people back in, because when Pretty Things closed, it was very sad. So, but no. All right. Anyway, sorry, we're not talking about IPA anymore.
Yeah, but the beer I was on about with all the Goldings in, that was the first beer I did with Pretty Things.
Yes, which is, are you going to do anything with St. Mars, their new brewery in Sheffield, or do they?
Yeah, I mean they've well, they rebrewed that recipe, the strong mild one, but no, it didn't work out as strong. I think it was only about 8%, because the original was 10.5.
Yeah, only 8%.
So. But yeah, well, hopefully I might be going there in a couple of weeks because I'm over in the UK and I want to go up and see Dan and Martha. So
they're very nice people, yeah. So
yeah. No, I've known them quite a long while. Well, I've known them before Pretty Things even.
Oh well, yeah. They're super people. All right, we're not talking about IPA anymore. So sorry, Don, do you have any more questions?
No, that was my last question. So
we're basically just Ron and I talk for the next hour about non-beer related. They're like beer related stuff.
So the answer to the last question was Jaipur. Is that kind of or Worthington White Shield if you can get it? Is that?
Yeah, if you can get it. Yeah. Yeah. Or Draft Bass. After Draft Bass as well.
Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, because you can't get Draft Bass in America, I don't believe, but you can. But yeah.
I mean the Bass they sold in the States was a different beer.
Yeah, you can get Draft Bass because I've had it. I had it at CVC in Minneapolis. But yeah, no, I've never had Draft UK Bass. It looks lovely.
Yeah, it can be a really good beer, but yeah, it used to be better when it still went through the unions. But I mean, the stupid thing is they could actually put it through union sets again now, because it's brewed at Marston's and they're the only people who've got a union set.
Right.
That's true. And talking about a Burton Union is a discussion for another day, probably.
But another bit to say would be Marston's Pedigree, which is put through union sets, and I think the only pale ale that is.
And you can buy that. You can get that in the UK.
Marston's Pedigree.
Yeah. Oh yeah, because that'll be brewed outside of London. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And people were saying it didn't really have the Burton character anymore, because I know last time I drank it, which was probably about 10 years or so, it had the genuine Burton farty smell, which you should get from a proper Burton pale ale. Loads of sulfur dioxide.
Delicious.
Yeah. Which is a strange thing, but
Burton Snatch.
I'm not sure.
Burton
Snatch. Yeah, I'm not sure it has that anymore, which would be a real shame if it doesn't.
Awesome. Ron, if people want to read your latest writing and follow you, what are your social media handles, or how can people get in touch with you?
Well, Shut Up About Barclay Perkins is my blog. So, I mean, it's got a fairly distinctive name, so I think it's fairly easy to find. And I've got lots of books. I mean, I've just released a couple of books. I mean, one on the history of London Stout, and another on brewing during World War II.
Awesome. Thank you, Ron.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Ron. We really appreciate it.
Okay, well, it's been fun.
Yeah. All right. Cheers.
Okay.
Ron.
Estrella Galicia is an independent family-owned brewery in Northwest Spain, founded in 1906. Estrella Galicia Cerveza Especial is a world-class lager brewed using the finest Spanish malts, locally cultivated Galician hops, and the best brewing practices made out of the state-of-the-art facility in A Coruna. Recognized around the world for quality and exceptional character, Estrella Galicia is a beer like no other. To learn more about Estrella Galicia, follow them at Estrella Galicia USA on Instagram.
All About Beer is back, and we're asking for your support to help provide the independent beer media this rich and colorful industry deserves. Visit our website, allaboutbeer.com, where we're frequently posting new content. And please consider throwing us a few bucks at patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We have low-cost memberships for individuals and small and large companies alike. Every dollar goes to help produce new articles and podcasts.
Looking for an easy hop sourcing experience? Yakima Valley Hops offers the finest quality hops from right here in our valley and premium growing regions around the world. Get the hops you need when you need them with ultra-fast shipping and awesome customer service. With a full line of liquid hop products and all your favorite varieties, no contracts are needed to brew with the best. Shop now at yakimavalleyhops.com. That's YAKIMA valleyhops.com.
Mike Karnowski is the owner brewer at Zebulon Artisanal Ales in Weaverville, North Carolina, that he runs with his wife, Gabrielle. He is the author of Homebrew, Beyond the Basics, a homebrewer since 1986 and a historic beer enthusiast. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So tell us, I guess, a little bit about Zebulon. And in particular, I know that you like to make historic styles. So maybe tell us some interesting historic IPAs that you've made.
Last year, we did a box set of 6 historical IPAs following the trajectory, the rise and fall of English IPA. And we followed it starting from like a late 1700s IPA, and then all the way through the World Wars and post-World War. It's really doesn't exist other than name. You know what I mean? That they would use IPA, but it really was a 3.5% golden bitter with 20 to 30 IBUs. You know, it was far cry from what it was, and then finished up with the rebirth of it on the west coast of the U.S. with Liberty Ale in 1974.
Oh, wow. So you cover, if my math is right, almost 300 years of history in 6 beers.
Yeah. It's fun to drink along with history lessons for sure.
So can you tell us, like, I guess what the time periods were of those 6 periods, and then 6 beers, sorry. And then how do I assume that the evolution of beer is gradual. And so how do you say, okay, this is one historic IPA, and then, you know, whatever it is, 70 years later, it's evolved enough that I can call this another IPA, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, if you're talking about the early period, like 1700s to the 1800s, not a lot is changing. I mean, I don't want to go too deep into it, but even the words ale and beer become very problematic in the 1700s, in that beer was a hopped malt beverage, and ale was a non-hopped. So pale ale, you know, if you're talking, you know, early 1700s, that doesn't have any hops in it at all. It would have been called pale beer. And eventually ale fell out of favor, and everything just started becoming called ale. But in the 1700s, early 1800s, IPA, well, it would have just been pale ale. I think that's one thing we need to get out of the way right away, was that IPA was not a specific beer brewed to ship to India. They were just sending pale ale over there.
Yeah.
And pale ale in the 1700s, early 1800s, was just 100% pale malt and a boatload of traditional hops. And then it was put into barrels where it would undergo a secondary fermentation with Brettanomyces for a whole year before they would even put it on the ship to send it to India. So the idea that this would be a year and a half, and then they would rebottle it, or they would, they'd send it in casks to India, and then they would bottle it in India at being a year and a half old. So it's so alien to a modern IPA drinker to think of it, and that's what we start off our box set with, is a circa 1750 IPA, which is 100% Maris Otter, 160 IBUs of East Kent Goldings.
Whole leaf?
Put into a bear. No, I can't do whole leaf
Okay.
on my.
Okay, just ask.
But and I can't even imagine trying
Right?
to separate. Back in the day, they had things called hop presses, I think they were called, where they would squeeze the hops to get the juice out. But it's hard enough making 160 IBU beer with 4% Goldings. I mean, you're basically making hop pesto. And so we take the. I mean, it's very bitter and very rough at coming out of the fermenter. But then when you put it into oak barrels, leave it there full year with Brettanomyces, and then you take it out, dry hop it, package it up, and it's just an unbelievable beer. But again, very alien. I'm almost hesitant to put IPA on it because it really is more like an imperial Orval, if you can understand what I'm talking about.
Oh yeah.
Just funky, but with imagine like a 8% Orval with mouth coating hop resin, and you kind of get the idea of what it is. It's very fun and just a very interesting, challenging beer, but not something that a lot of modern IPA drinkers can wrap their head around.
That sounds actually really great.
Yes.
I would like to go to there. That sounds wonderful to me. But I'm not a typical drinker, so
Yeah, I mean that's the beauty of Zebulon, is we're a tiny little brewery on a back alley in a small town where we can get away with whatever we want to. We don't have to dumb down beers for the masses. We can get as geeky and nerdy as we want, because it's just me and my wife running it.
Yeah. So,
but if we're going to continue,
yeah, please. That's what I was going to say.
Continue with IPA. So that's going to be what IPA tastes like in India. It's what it's going to be throughout the 1700s, early 1800s, and then that's when the interesting interaction between technology and IPA come into play. They went from sailing ships that would take 6 months to travel from England to India. They had to go all the way down across, around the Horn of Africa. And then they invented steamships somewhere in the mid 1800s. And all of a sudden, instead of 6 months, it takes 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And then they're able to drop the IBUs, the bittering levels of the beer, because it doesn't need to, make this really treacherous hot voyage over there. And then they and then like another 30, 40 years later, they opened up the Suez Canal, which made it so they could get there in just a week. And the hop levels just keep dropping every time. So this is an example of a beer evolving and changing right alongside technological advances that, it's very interesting to follow along and drink along with as these things happen. And then, of course, there's World War, which is the main event that really destroys British beer. In say 1910, before World War I happens, even an English mild would be 6%. That's a starting point. 6, 7, 8% was the strength of English beers before World War I. And then 10 years later, after World War I ended, everything's half of what it was. and it really never recovers. You know, it gets a little bump in between World War One and World War Two, but and World War Two, it goes back down again, and at that point, it's done. You know, a mild that was 6%, you know, 50 years earlier is now a 3.5%er. And IPA post World Wars, it really doesn't exist. They haven't sent pale ale to India for decades, and they've given up on the barrel aging with Brett 100 years earlier. So this is all, you know, in the 1950s, an average IPA was just a very boring golden bitter with 20 to 30 IBUs. That was all. It was just a name. You know, it didn't mean anything at all. It definitely didn't have any connection with the crazy IPA we were talking about that started it all off in the 1700s.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Sort of like today, where IPA doesn't really mean anything. Just kidding.
Yeah, I mean, now we're in the golden age of IPA with lactose fruited sour IPAs, right?
There are, I think that I counted, there's over 25 different varieties of IPA.
In the BJCP
Yeah.
or
No, in the BJCP, I think there's like 12
okay.
or 10.
But if anything, we can console ourselves knowing that IPA has been a fairly meaningless term for almost 100 years.
What's it? Yeah, because it's a marketing term as well, and it's
it was a marketing term in 1940. It's a marketing term today. So
Yeah.
it's been a long time in the meaningless sort of. Not meaningless. I mean, it means whatever it means in the time and age that you're in. You know what you're ordering. They knew in 1955 that if they ordered an IPA, it was just going to be a refreshing cask bitter. I'm not sure what I'm going to get when I order an IPA nowadays. I have to read the fine print.
So thank you. I never really thought about those technological, steamship versus sailing ship and the Suez Canal. So I appreciate that. Not just time though. Would geography have played into this at all? And what I'm thinking is maybe some brewers in Britain have easier access to certain hops or Maris Otter versus Golden Promise or whatever. Was geography a factor as well or not?
Only in the sense of getting the beer out to India.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So if you were an inland brewery, you were not one of the ones making beer for export. The breweries like Bass Ale were right there on the I don't know, is it the Thames or a main river that leads to the ocean.
Right.
Burton on Trent, right? So Trent would be the
Trent
river.
yeah.
And so the breweries that had access to ships to send beer to India were the ones making it, as you would expect. And again, with technology, brewery size in England really exploded once they had railroads where they could move beer, to outside of your city. If before that, all English breweries were small local breweries because you didn't have any way to get your beer to other towns. And then all of a sudden, once they had railroads, they could move the malt around, they could move the beer around, and it really changed everything and led to the onslaught of huge, giant breweries like Whitbread and Truman, these ones that are just the Anheuser-Busch's of their day.
Right. How do you find authentic recipes, and how do you remain true to those recipes, given that you have presumably modern ingredients and well, for example, you were saying that you use hop pellets versus whole leaf as a matter of modern necessity. So how do you try to remain as authentic as you can?
Yeah, I mean, you do the best you can. All my recipes and basically all the knowledge that I'm regurgitating here has been learned through the beer researchers and authors like Ron Pattinson and Martin Cornell, Pete Best. And so I'm not digging through brewery basements looking for recipes. These guys have already done it, and they've translated. Ron will go into how he'll have to, really research how, what was a hogshead. How much was that? How many gallons is a hogshead, or a bushel. A bushel will change from time to time as to how many pounds that was, and depending on where you were. So it's very complicated.
Right.
But so I rely on these researchers who have done the research and printed up the recipes, and that the ingredients are remarkably the same as they were back in the day. I mean, I think if I gave one of my 1700 IPAs to somebody from 1700s, they would be like, that's the flavor. That's it's not, when you're doing 160 IBUs of Goldings, I don't think it matters a whole lot whether it's pellet or whole hops. It's so intense of a level that maybe it's even better. You never know if those English brewers would have rather used pellets.
Mm.
They just didn't have the option. But you can imagine I'm throwing, for any homebrewers out there, it's the equivalent of 1 pound of hops in 5 gallons of beer. So it's a huge mass of vegetal matter in the air, and pellets don't really help out a lot. But I can't imagine trying to strain out a full pound of whole hops out of a 5-gallon batch. It's just, it's going to soak up almost all the work. It's complicated, but I feel good that the beers I'm making would be recognizable to the drinkers back then, and I just get as close as I can. There'll be people who be like, "Oh, we don't even know what hops they were using or what the alpha acids were back then." But Ron's done research where he's like, "I found a hop an analysis in like 1907 of East Kent Goldings, and they were 6.7 alpha." So you know what I mean? That the fact that they haven't really changed, that makes me feel comfortable that the ingredients are not that different. It's not like I'm using Citra or Mosaic or anything. Goldings has been around since the 1700s. So it's not like I'm having to choose modern hop varieties for these. This is the same hop they were using. The barley was always, sketchy, because England never had enough barley to service its industry, its brewing industry. They always were importing barley from all over the world. You'll see easily, 10-20% California barley and Syrian barley and European barley, and they would bring it all into England and malt it. They weren't buying malted barley, but they would source barley from all over the world. So it's always kind of been a hodgepodge. We're trying to pinpoint exactly what one brewery was using is pretty futile, and it's not really going to help make that beer more authentic, I don't think.
This might be a dumb question, and I even acknowledge that as I still nonetheless ask it. Would the malt might it have been under modified? Would it require any kind of step mashing? Certainly not a decoction, but
no, not in England. No, they really didn't do that. It was all infusion. They would do this thing called underletting, where they just pump the water into the mash from underneath, and they would fill it up at 150 degrees, and then they'd drain it, and then they'd fill it up again at 155 degrees, and then drain it, and then fill it up at 160 degrees and drain it. So it's kind of this batch sparging type thing, and often each different sparge would go into a different fermenter or a different kettle and boiled up, and then they would blend those 3 different beers to make 6 different final products going out, adding caramel coloring. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Fuller still sort of does that.
I thought it'd be funny to ask like a modern brew house manufacturer. It's like, all right, I need a 20-barrel mash tun, and then I need 3 7-gallon kettles. You know, where they'd be like, "What are you talking about?" But that's how they brewed. They had one giant mash, and they would just send each wort off into different kettles with different hops and then different fermenters, and then do this weird blending afterwards, coloring, and it's amazing they could get just with one big mash. They can make an entire brewery's portfolio
Right.
at the pub.
Right. Interesting. Em, did you have any questions?
I do actually. So when you're making these, are you are you talking to Ron Pattinson or Martin Cornell, or are you just using their literature to make stuff? So because they're pretty available. I always find Ron likes to make sure that people are doing when they're doing beer history, he makes himself available. So
yeah, we've brought Ron to town 4 or 5 times over the last 8-9 years. Even when I was brewing at Green Man, we brought him into town and did a whole evolution of English mild lecture with associated pours of historical milds. And we've done that 4 or 5 times, I think, over the years. And we're planning on one next year for Asheville Beer Week, which is going to be really fun. We're going to turn Zebulon into an English pub in the middle of World War II, where we're going to have bombers going over and the smell of gunpowder in the air. And I'd love to get a World War II reenactment out in front of the brewery. But, the idea, drinking in World War II at pubs was a very strange experience. I mean, the government was shutting down the pubs for other than just an hour or two in the afternoon and an hour or two at evening. All the beer gravities were legislated, down. So it's going to be a weird event because I try to think of people who are just coming here to try our normal beers, and they come in and there's just bombs going off and the dogs are freaking out. It's 8 beers and they're all 3% or under. I'm like, you know what, but it'll be fun to do it. And when those people go home to Florida or wherever, I think they'll forget all about the 20 hazy pale IPA breweries they went to, and they'll be like, what was that one that had the bombs going off? And all the beer was so watery or something. But that's the kind of stuff I can get away with being a tiny little brewery. It's like owning a tiny record label. You know what I mean? You're responsible for putting out the weirdo stuff. Nobody else is going to do it if you don't do it. So that's our plan. Yeah, bringing Ron in. He's got a new set of books out called Blitzkrieg, and it's English brewing during World War II. And there's the history part is like a 400-page book, and then the recipes are a separate book. It's like almost 800 pages.
Oh my goodness.
They're monsters. Some of Ron's books, he likes to sign them as being like, you can use this as a weapon. Because they're huge. Like his Porter book is great. It's over 800 pages, I think. And it's just, the entire rise and fall of Porter, full of recipes and everything. We're lucky to have Ron doing all this work for sure.
You don't need bombs going off. You just drop his books on the floor.
Yeah, for sure.
Please reserve 2 spots for Em and I. We will be there.
Oh yeah, that would be awesome.
Okay, so we did speak with Ron Pattinson as well, and we can tell from talking to him, and I can tell from talking to you, you're very passionate about this. Why do you think? How did you get infected by this historic beer bug? What do you find interesting about it? And then I guess for the modern drinker, what do you hope they'll take away from drinking your beers? That was a lot of questions in one.
The overall answer is that I want people to know that beer was always good. You know what I mean? I want to throw respect to the brewers of the past. They were always making the best beer they could, and just because it's from 200 years ago doesn't mean it was sour or smoky or weird. That some of these beers are delicious, and are as good as a modern equivalent. And also, I think it's important to ground if you're somebody who's very geeky about beer, to know what, like, say you really want to understand IPAs, it's good to know what the starting point was, and then you can go off and, explore the West Coast 1990s IPAs. You can go and do the hazies, you can do the milkshakes, but to know that how it all started was, a funky barrel-aged, monster. That never hurts anybody to ground themselves, calibrate themselves. And I like being able to produce these, I guess, calibratable beers or something. If for nothing else, you can say, I know what porter tasted like in 1850. And what that seems much more important to me than making yet another lactose, vanilla, candy bar porter. You know what I mean? It's like the market's full of that, and I just feel that if I'm going to make a porter, what is something nobody else is doing? And the historical path is one I'm just drawn to. I guess because I'm an old man. I started homebrewing in '86, so I've been doing this forever. And sometimes I see the path that craft beer is on, like a lot of gimmickry and fads and that. And I could, my safe space is mid 1800s English beers and classic German lagers. I mean, to me, they're timeless, they're beautiful, they're subtle, and they've got, the story. Stories really helps. It's almost like the secret fifth ingredient is the story behind the beer you're drinking. You know what I mean? If I just give you a random porter, you're just going to judge it however. But if I say this is a reproduction of a porter, it's an illegal porter from 1830s where they weren't allowed to use colorants or whatever, and it has this great story of how they were cooking down licorice root in the pub to add to casks to make it, to stretch it out or whatever. All of a sudden you got this really interesting story that you're digging into the flavors, trying to find these, and that to me is just, how can you go wrong doing that?
That's awesome.
Well, that's
I mean, it kind of,
yeah.
It's tough putting it on the label of a beer bottle for sure, but that's why most of it we sell in-house at the tap room, where we can tell people the story, and then do these events with Ron where he can sit there and just walk you through the Nazi U-boats circling England and the brewers trying to make a Russian an imperial stout that's 4.5%, and trying to make it taste like a real imperial stout, getting back to trying to understand how the brewers in their minds are dealing with these things, and always trying to do the best to get a lot of flavor and character in the beers, even if they're being forced by the government to make them lower and lower alcohol.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Your recipes are forever. That was what I was going to say. You can always go back and relive a little history by brewing these beers, which you do, which is very cool.
Yeah, it is.
And it gets me off the hook too. If people don't like it, I just tell them, hey, it's not my beer. It's some brewers from 1860.
Hey, go get in your time machine and go talk to them.
and tell me I'm doing it wrong. So for homebrewers listening to this who maybe want to make a historic IPA, where should they start? How would they find a recipe or a style, and what can they do to make their beer more authentic?
I would send them to Amazon to buy Ron's book, the what's it called, the Homebrewer's Guide to Historical Beers, I believe that's what it's called. And in that, he goes through he's got multiple chapters, and he's got a whole chapter on IPA, and he'll give you 15 different recipes from across the ages to reproduce.
Okay. And it is doable by a home brewer.
Oh, absolutely. Sure.
Awesome. Em, did you have any other questions?
No, I think this was really enlightening. I really appreciate all your insight and the fact that you're keeping a lot of these beers alive, and it's just really cool stuff.
Thank you, Mike.
Don't stop believing.
Thank you, Mike, and we'll see you during Asheville Beer Week so that we can taste these IPAs through time. That's amazing.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to
Either
learn more about you, how can they, sorry to interrupt, how can they get in touch with you? Social media or website?
Yeah, ZebulonBrewing.com is a website. On Instagram, Zebulon Brewing. And then my personal, Mike Karnowski at Facebook, if you want to follow along with any other musical side projects or anything like that.
Cool. Awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Mike. Cheers.
Yeah, thank
Keep
you
on
so
rocking
much.
it up,
Yeah.
free world.
Cheers.
Cheers. So, Em, how did you like that episode?
So cool. I love how everything comes back again.
Yeah.
You know, like everything is cool, is new again. How IPAs are, are an aged, typically like, are historically an aged beer. Like I am one of those people that's like, this
Check the
IPA
date
6 sweet. Oh,
code.
check the date code, especially when I buy beer. I'm always checking the date codes. And the fact that this beer just sat outside for a
with
year,
Brett.
With Brett before they put it on a boat, like that's.
And then that's 6 more weeks or 6 months or whatever.
Yeah, whatever. Like it's just really
in the heat.
cool. Yeah.
Right.
Very, very, very very cool stuff.
Cold supply chain.
It made me appreciate IPAs even more, even though they are essentially it's a marketing phrase, but in a marketing phrase that spanned now more than 25 different styles. I almost think that IPA is its own. It's like ales. It's under that like ales. So it's like IPAs, stouts, porters.
Right.
It's a catch-all. It's not a catch-all, but like it almost has its own umbrella.
Yeah.
Because there's just so many of them, especially with celebrating IPA Day that we had recently. Like I counted all the ones I could think of, and there are a lot.
And now I feel better about myself that in my own personal beer cellar, I have IPAs that are like years and years old because I just didn't get around to them. So,
well, maybe you should have. I would go have one.
I'm gonna go drink those right now. So please visit allaboutbeer.com and follow us on social media at allaboutbeer. And if you're feeling generous, please visit patreon.com/allaboutbeer to support this show and others. If you have questions for the experts or suggestions for the show, please email us at podcast@allaboutbeer.com. That's also the email for feedback, suggestions, and to inquire about supporting this show through advertising. Speaking of advertising, here's a short word from our sponsors.
Looking for an easy hop sourcing experience? Yakima Valley Hops offers the finest quality hops from right here in our valley and premium growing regions around the world. Get the hops you need when you need them with ultra-fast shipping and awesome customer service. With a full line of liquid hop products and all your favorite varieties, no contracts are needed to brew with the best. Shop now at yakimavalleyhops.com. That's YAKIMA valleyhops.com.
All About Beer is back, and we're asking for your support to help provide the independent beer media this rich and colorful industry deserves. Visit our website, allaboutbeer.com, where we're frequently posting new content. And please consider throwing us a few bucks at patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We have low-cost memberships for individuals and small and large companies alike. Every dollar goes to help produce new articles and podcasts.
Estrella Galicia is an independent family-owned brewery in northwest Spain, founded in 1906. Estrella Galicia Cerveza Especial is a world-class lager brewed using the finest Spanish malts, locally cultivated Galician hops, and the best brewing practices made out of the state-of-the-art facility in A Coruna. Recognized around the world for quality and exceptional character, Estrella Galicia is a beer like no other. To learn more about Estrella Galicia, follow them at Estrella Galicia USA on Instagram.
Em, how can people find you on social media?
I am at Pints and Panels across all social media, and my website is www.pintsandpanels.com. What about you, Don?
I am at the Dawn of Beer on X, Threads, and Instagram. And people can drop me an email at dawn@thedawnofbeer.com. This show is produced by All About Beer. Visit allaboutbeer.com for articles, notes on this show and others, and to connect via the newsletter and social media. Cheers.
Cheers, keep drinking IPA.
Old IPA.
Old IPAs forever.
Cheers.